Welcome to Platemark Series 2, A History of Western Printmaking with me, Ann Shafer, and I'm here with my unbelievably fabulous co-host,
Tru Ludwig.
Correctamundo. All right, today we have more fun Italian history of prints for you, but before we do that, we're just going to hop right into our positionality so we can get rolling.
Go for it.
Okay, I'll go first. I identify as a cis-het white woman, and I use she, her pronouns. We are recording this in the Purple Crayon Press in Baltimore, Maryland, the land of the Piscataway Conoy people.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Tru Ludwig. I identify as a trans, white, gay, male, using he, him pronouns, and I'm delighted to be here with you today.
I wanted to say why we believe the history of prints is the most important thing ever.
Well, because it touches on absolutely everything, and we can show it today more than ever because it touches on social history and cultural history and visual information and various ways of delivering maps, ideas, books, images, how we spin the political view of someone with an image that could be circulated far more effectively than even what can be done today, because there was no Fox News to bend or tweak. There was no NPR to bend or tweak. It was what a person got, and maybe they weren't even people who could read, but they saw an image of something. It would definitely have an impact on how they perceived it. And, you know, the more of a certain kind of image you present, the more you can steer thinking. And so, of course, the history of print, starting in its beginnings, we would say is essentially the history of the church.
In the beginning, yeah. And I also always want to remind people that the invention of the printing press is the most important invention to modern humankind.
Yes, actually. I still show a page from the life's top most important inventions of the millennia. And the printing press is like, bing, right there near top. And Martin Luther has been considered to be maybe the third most important because of how she created that rift that would redraw maps across the globe, really.
And history.
Yeah. But history of prints, I mean, today especially, I think we get to see even more how it's not just about images of the Virgin Mary and certain saints that might protect you if you were going on a pilgrimage, or making pretty stories of the whole Passion of the Christ for wealthy patrons' collections. But it's also an opportunity to see how top level, quote, painters, we call them artists, and that immediately makes us think of painters, and sorry, sculptors, then we say sculptors, and then sorry, architects, then we add architecture. But we should always put print right in the middle of all of that.
And because they're never really there.
No, it has. It's always been, and I remember them being told that it was the ugly stepchild of painting. This is essentially what Ann and I did on our summer vacation, except it's the voyage of us doing history of prints together at the Baltimore Museum of Art. And much of that collection we used, but we also had to tailor the class to what existed in the collection so that the students could actually see what was there.
Right, so they missed a few things.
Well,
we didn't have them.
Well, either we didn't have them, or we just plain didn't pay that much attention to them, or, you know, there's a way of creating any history by leaving certain things out. Because
True enough.
History is written by the victors, correct?
Yes.
But we are now finding in this wonderful 21st century how many more victors there were in our history, in terms of deciding that it's about all kinds of folks making all kinds of things. What prints could become, I think we start to see it even more when we talk about Titian.
Okay.
Because he's up there in Venice, and Venice is kind of its own little planet up there at the top of the Adriatic Sea. And just the other day, Ann and I were squabbling about the concept of fine art, air quotes around fine, versus art, and the idea of, you know, whose art is it, and so on and so forth. So today we're actually going to go into the Italians a little bit more in a new way, because I never really got to address the idea of Titian, who should have been a Ninja Turtle, but was denied his turtlehood. Because, you know, we have Donatello and Leonardo and Raphael and Michelangelo. But if they were thinking they should have added Giotto, of course, and Titian.
Okay.
But Titian really deserves to be a turtle, a Ninja Turtle. And the thing about Titian is that he comes from Venice, and he is Venice. And, you know, if we're talking about Titian, we're talking about a guy who lived as long as Michelangelo.
Is that right?
Yeah, he lived to 88 years at least. And then, he was, I find it humorous to say he was born either in 1488 or 1490, which must have been really hard on his mom. But we know he died in 1575. And that's only 9 years after Michelangelo. So, these two guys are kind of paralleling each other all across the high Renaissance, essentially. But Titian kind of creates his own Venetian Renaissance because it's a different mindset. It's a different part of the Italian peninsula.
It looks totally different.
It totally does. And so, when we think about the high Renaissance, we think of the Ninja Turtles, Leonardo, Raphael, and Michelangelo. We're talking about artists that were painting and working in Florence and Rome, which has a very certain kind of flavor that is intellectual and sterner and far more straight line Bible related, because it's a different ethos. For instance, Florence considered itself the new Athens after the fall of Constantinople in 1453. I mean, their scholars all go blah, and they come rushing across to where the money actually still exists, which is where the Medici are hanging forth in Florence. And I use an illustration of Lorenzo the Magnificent surrounded by these scholars, and they would gather and have a salon of smart things to discuss in the Palazzo Medici Riccardi. It's just, and to think that at the time Florence was no larger than 100,000 people.
Really?
That spawned this Renaissance. That's the part that amazes me. And Paris was nowhere near even 1 million. It was teeny.
Huh.
I think it was maybe in the mid 200s.
Wow.
Yeah.
Today, if you go to Florence, I'm amazed that you can walk the entire city.
Yeah.
Like, it's tiny.
Well, that's why it's a perfect second honeymoon.
It is perfect.
Because, even as you get older, you can still make it around to all the best sites and end up having vino and some tasty roast boar, and you'd be a very happy camper. So the idea of Florence as this cultural microcosm of all these new ideas that are, these reborn ideas that are circulating. And then I mentioned that Florence had fallen in 1494 when the Medici were expelled, literally, because all of these problems that we're having and the invasions that we're experiencing are all caused by the decline of proper artwork, because they've debased Christianity. Savonarola, who's this Dominican monk, rails against them, and he literally gets the Medici family. Well, Lorenzo dies in 1492. He gets the rest of them drummed out in 1494. It's just very interesting to see how that happens. Well, okay, you're a Florentine.
The power centers that flip between wealthy families and the church is amazing.
Yeah, well, yes, indeed. But those artists, many of them go, and they rush off to Rome, right? And it's a good time to be in Rome, because that's when Julius II is he's actually selling all those indulgences so that he can rebuild St. Peter's and create this new hub of Christendom that'll be the newest, most wonderful rebirth of Greco-Roman antiquity. But at the exact same time, up there at the top of the Adriatic Sea, we have Venice, which has been holding forth in its own wonderful way as this special moment, as this incredibly cosmopolitan area on the Silk Road. It's an incredibly strong place, and because of its maritime trade. It's incredibly strong because it has dealings with up with the Flemish, with the Germans, with the people from the far and near East, and you can see that reflected in the artwork because of all these different kinds of faces and hairstyles and hats and whatnot that the Venetian artists love to document. And, Venice is a totally different kind of a creature, because here you have Florence and Rome sort of as Washington, D.C., and then you have Venice as not New York. No, I think Venice is like Venice, California. You think color and light and a city that's on these shifting, wonderful, watery colors and there's clouds moving in. And
the light is different.
Oh, it's completely different.
It's amazing when you go. You're like, holy cow.
Oh, is that why the artwork looks like that?
Exactly.
It's like, and your main in Palazzo San Marco, it floods all the time. You guys are cool with it. Okay, fine. Well, our city's underwater sometimes, and we'll just still live our lives. And it blows my mind, and you go walk into San Marco, which has, been around since, the 1000s. And every inch of the interior is covered as like a Byzantine Christian church would be. Venice was already a thriving capital, actually, in the print world. Aldus Manutius had established a press in Venice, and he's the one who published the Hypnerotomachia Polyphily, that most beautiful book of all time, where the text and the image were so beautifully arrayed on the page that it just, the balance of it. And we'd actually, Ann and I had mentioned before how the woodcuts they look like elegant restatements almost of Botticelli woodcuts. They show the world in perspective, literally in linear perspective. They show, Polyphilus wandering around in his love dream looking for his beloved Pollio, and he's wandering through all of these various lands. But the treatment of the woodcut in this is incredibly high quality, as is the array on the page. And one thing I wanted to mention about Aldus Manutius is his motto was Festina lente.
Yeah.
Make haste rapidly, which was the need for someone who was working with type to make haste, but do it carefully.
Right.
And that's how making these books as beautifully as he did. So that was published in 1499. Another thing that just tells us how different Venice was a massive map, and it's actually referred to as oftentimes as the Barberi map. And it was done by Jacopo de Barberi. And it's this 6-plate woodcut view of Venice from 1500, from that big year, 1500. Well, it has every right to be called the Barberi map. And these are massive wood plates because the overall dimensions of this thing are 4.5 feet by 9 feet, 3 inches.
Yeah, it's huge.
It is. And we saw it together and we're like, what?
Yeah.
But then let's think about what? Because what it is an incredibly accurate bird's eye view of Venice before balloons. We have Venice sitting up there, at the top of the Adriatic. And it's such a sweet, beautiful, stunning representation of the various canals and the alleyways and the streets and the placement of the homes and the harbor and the ships in the harbor and the seas around. And it's so sweet because above Venice, there's actually a figure of Mercury, who's the god of commerce. Mm-hmm. And then happily going floop, floop, floop on a dolphin in the harbor is, Neptune, the god of the sea. And it really shows how strong they are. And the four winds, which are very sweet, right? So you've got the four winds from each of the four
Puto heads.
Yeah. The four winds, that'll come up later too.
Yeah.
But there they are blowing sails around Venice. But you folks, you got to understand how truly astonishing this image is. All of the houses are depicted, all of the church towers, everything is alarmingly accurate. And they figure that he and himself and maybe a couple others went to every tall church tower there was in Venice to try and document it. But it is 6 massive plates. Let's say that they're essentially 3 feet across each.
Oh, gosh.
And with this kind of the level of carving here, it is not just a map. It is truly art. It is of the highest caliber.
Oh, it's beautiful. So
Jacopo de Barberi was doing that. And he made a number of other prints, and I'm not going to dwell on many of those. But it's interesting to see him depicting the city with that much care. The only other view I can think of a city earlier would be the view of Nuremberg, in the Nuremberg Chronicle from 1493, and they do views of other cities like Damascus and some of them like Jerusalem and places that they clearly haven't been yet, which are repetitions of certain other cities. There's 600, I think it's like 685 blocks in the Nuremberg Chronicle, but some woodcuts of cities are reused because, there's a city and we're going to write about a city now. But this is so specific. This Barberi map is so specific to its area that I wanted to have you realize how much difference there was in these 7 years between what's being published in Nuremberg and what's going on in Venice at this moment. Here's another thing about the Barberi map that I find fascinating, which was that it's an Italian map. It was drawn by an Italian, but it was published where? In Nuremberg.
What?
Yeah, by a printer named Anton Kolb. But now I think that's strange because Koberger is. But Kolb, and several sources say that that's who printed it in 1500. Well, let's think about that. because Jacopo de Barbari was called that because he's the first Italian artist to travel over the Alps, and that's why he is Jacopo the Barbarian, because he went someplace that's not here, and that's why he gets that name. Well, okay, so it was published in Nuremberg. Well, gee, who's coming up in Nuremberg at that time?
Our friend Albrecht Dürer.
Correct. And so who starts doing large-scale woodcuts? If we were to line up Titian's contribution and Dürer's, the Triumphal Arch of Maximilian is from 1515.
Right.
And the Triumphal Chariot of Maximilian is from 1523. So they knew each other. Mm-hmm. He was not just aware of them, there was communication there. Oh. And certainly visual communication, but there could very well have been actual communication. The dude's in his town. So Jacopo da Barbari gives us this unbelievable view of Venice, which tells us right off the bat that we're in a different territory. And it shows us woodcut being used by the Italians in a magnificent way. And that right there tells you, when you're looking at an image that's 4.5 feet by 9 foot 3 inches, that's not just wallpaper. I mean, because it's not exactly cheap. These were some of the biggest pieces of paper that had ever been created to be able to make this thing, which tells you that's June takes it to a whole higher level, right? So we're talking 3 feet by 2.5 feet. I mean, come on.
That's a big piece of paper.
That's amazing, right? It's since in 100 years. And we also know that the Venetians were pretty experimental with their papers because, as we'll see with the Master of the Die, who was making prints that was one we would pull out from the collection. It was done about 1530, that transfiguration is printed on blue paper.
Right.
And the Venetians loved their blue paper or their pinkish paper because it was made from rags that had that tonality to them. That's not something you see down in the very stern intellectual Washington, D.C. type Rome, Florence realm. And so when we think about, woodcuts as wallpaper, and you don't think of this painter, Titian, as this colorist, but he was actually a red-hot draftsman too. I mean, he could really, really draw. He had this peculiar, shaky, wonderful calligraphic line, much different than the Italians in the South. But he had his own mark, and it was something that the woodcutters could emulate. And thank you, Giorgione and Bellini, that we get to see feminine flesh, nude females reclining, and we get to see the rebirth of mythology, all sexy and yummy, and set in these Arcadian landscapes with trees and beautiful sunlit skies and hormones and
hormones.
Totally.
I was thinking romance, but hormones is probably more.
Well, yeah. I mean, if I show them the Feast of the Gods, which we have down at the National Gallery in Washington, I do a couple little close-ups, and there's a little satyr that's like wah wah wah, and then there's a guy whose hand is literally creeping into the lap of the lady who's sleeping next to him, and you're like, that's a different climate. Mentally, intellectually, psychologically, emotionally, and it's a culture that, for those who were buying paintings that were not sacred, would extol the beauty of the female body. I just got back from that extraordinary exhibition up in Boston of the 6 paintings that Titian had done for Philip II.
Where was that show?
At the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. And it's fascinating to see, these luscious, creamy white bodies of women arrayed across these 6 paintings, all with incredible stories behind them, mythological stories. Danaë, who is inseminated, shall we say, in the form of gold coins that rain down from above because Zeus wants to have time with Danaë. So, or, the rape of Europa. It's a rape, but at the same time, it's the most beautiful scene of a luscious woman clinging to the horn of a bull that's coming out of the sea and hauling her off as her friends on the far shore going, no! But it was a different time, and we just can't cancel that whole culture because the way women were viewed or are depicted or thought. And Ann's little head just does that thing goes because it's a completely different world.
Sure, and I don't think we should bury that kind of stuff either. I just think that we come to it with a lens that has some
differences.
Yes.
And that was the other wonderful thing about that exhibition, was because with each painting, there was a different kind of a voice that would discuss it, where it was a straight ahead white, male curator, or this smashing English historian who was talking about that wonderful pair of buttocks of Venus, who is saying goodbye to Adonis as he goes trekking off into the forest to get killed.
Was it a cell phone tour thing?
You could zap the QR code,
Oh, okay.
which is wonderful. So it wasn't a bunch of people with headphones. It was really beautifully done. And, to create an entire exhibition of 6 large paintings is a beautiful thing too. It's like, just pay attention to this, with a whole wonderful pre-didactic gallery.
Not to mention getting those paintings from far-flung
Russia, London, right. The Isabella Stewart.
Getting things out of Russia is a trick.
And it was a gorgeous, and you'll never see them all 6 together again.
No.
And so Venice, this unusual area, it's got its color, it's got its light, it's got its different maritime trades. It even has a different surface that the painters are working on. Because if you think about Florence and you think about Padua even, you think about Rome, you talk about frescoes. Or you have paint, but it's on wood panels. But now we're in Venice. And Venice has a thriving maritime trade, and it's built on the water. So you don't want to have frescoes on walls that are going to get waterlogged. And you don't want to have wood panels that are going to get all warped and disgusting because they're going to get waterlogged. But what's going in and out of that harbor constantly?
Canvas.
Yeah, canvas in the form of ships' sails.
Oh, the sails.
Duh! And it's so convenient.
Light bulb.
Because you can roll it up and it's portable.
Right,
you can't roll up a wall of a church.
No.
You can't, and wooden panel paintings aren't going to. So you get to a guy like Titian, who is, he's quite the interesting upstart. He's got a success parallel or maybe better than Raphael. In my little PowerPoint, I say that Titian, who born about 1490, well, he worked for Italian noblemen, of course. He worked and became the painter for the Republic of Venice. And remember, it's the Republic of Venice. It's not a duchy. He worked for a pope. He worked for 3 Holy Roman emperors. He painted for the King of France. He painted for the King of Spain. But he lived his entire life in Venice.
Huh.
How the hell did he do that?
Because he could roll up the paintings and ship them.
There you go.
And it's a total switch in
come on, it's
the market.
Absolutely. And the total switch in the market also is revealed with prints, because they're paper museums. They move, right? And when you think about, I think about Raphael, having Marcantonio Raimondi engrave his drawings. That concept of my drawings are wonderful. We always think about Titian, the painter, as a colorist, which, oh my God, of course he was. And he did that, the father of modern mode of painting, because he works with oil on canvas and he makes them portable, and he establishes his figures on a gessoed surface in about 4 brush strokes. And then eventually he comes back to it and he starts laying in, maybe a monochrome thing, but he gives it time and he reacts to the surface of the canvas itself, as opposed to having this completely mapped disegno that, the graphed drawings that you would expect from Leonardo or Raphael or even Michelangelo.
We know he worked that way.
Sure. It's written all about it. In fact, my notes talk about how he would establish, literally, he would establish, it's written up, I think it was Cennino Cennini who was writing up the methods of the artists.
Right.
And he talks about, he would do this with a number of canvases, and then he'd just turn them on the wall. And then he would come back and he would look at them.
Huh.
And the modern mode of painting.
I was just going to say, how modern?
Yes. And he'd look at them and go, and then he'd take it to the next step. And then he would, make some of these inspired additions as he was going along. And he never did them all at once. And that's one of those ways, is how he seems to, because they build them up, and it's not just focus on one thing, but he creates this thing that's living flesh of his characters that seem to completely meld with their environment in a different way than Leonardo's did. It's as though Leonardo understood, it's not that Titian didn't understand what's underneath the human form, but there's having just seen these paintings for real up at the Gardner, it was just to see how they really do become a part of the atmosphere in which they live. And he wasn't going to have to finish every edge. He could let things blur at the edges. In modern mode of painting, I mean, you could almost say that he's early impressionist, like Frans Hals or Rembrandt was, like Turner was, in a way that he applies his paint. It's a different mode completely. And it's this way that light is working over all of these different surfaces and all of these different textures that are delicious. And that's where you get the satins and the wonderful smooth female flesh with the Titian red hair, that lovely strawberry blonde. Right. So I'm thinking about this guy where he's now, let's say, in his, he's mid-20s. Much like Raphael or any of these other youngsters that want to, hey, there's this thing called prints and I can actually, get some ideas out there. And so I think we tend to overlook what Titian had accomplished in terms of print as well.
Did he have all of those well, maybe not in his mid-20s, but did he have a studio full of people who were like taking care of the drapery and the background and
It seems highly likely that he had his assistants. The circle of Titian, there can be no question that there were many artists that were like, gobbling it up. The circle of Titian, and I'll get to how important that is in a second. But I wanted for us to think about how he's come up working for Bellini, Giorgione and Bellini, these two guys that really helped establish this concept of Venetian painting and the idea of having it out in nature and really being absorbed in and by nature. It's really stunning. But I also think about him thinking, hey, here's this new thing called printmaking, and I think I can make it useful. And so he does. And we've actually also already mentioned one of the woodcuts that came from Titian's hand, and it literally says it on there. Remember our old friend Ugo de Carpi, who was doing wonderful chiaroscuro woodcuts for Parmigianino. Well, we have this, one of his very first, he does it in 1516, which is the same year Ugo de Carpi has this image of Titian's drawing of St. Jerome banging on his chest with a stone, and it's a beautiful two-color chiaroscuro woodcut. Don't you agree? It's just kind of...
It is beautiful.
I'm actually using a catalog from a National Gallery of Art exhibition that was from just a couple years ago. Great illustrations. But, right in dead center, I mean, if you made an X of this is one of the things that Titian does. He completely creates new forms of composition. They're not on this scaffolding of verticals and horizontals like you would expect with our Florentine buddies. But Titian uses the diagonal more than anybody else ever. He really inaugurates a whole new mode of picture making, just in terms of figures at diagonals, things that shift off into the distance in terms of perspective. Figures aren't just arrayed within 2 feet of the picture plane. They're twisted, they're torqued. He has a completely different set of perspectives on how he creates his images. And even in this image of old St. Jerome banging on his chest with a stone, almost dead center in that one piece of negative space, Titianus.
Right.
There's his name, bam,
smack in the middle.
And then UDC is hiding down there in the corner. And it's wonderful that Ugo de Carpi gets to put his name in, but you can tell by the strength of the figure, by the musculature of the figure, by the way the fabric is wrapping around this old but very gazillion man's hips, and how it's just stepped into a landscape that this is drawn by a real master who understands the bodily proportions and the motion of figures. And with this particular image, I want our folks to keep that in mind, because I'm going to talk about Titian's influence on a book that blows my mind soon. So there we have it. That's the same year that Ugo puts his petition to the Venetian government for his copyright, if you will, on the idea of doing this. I can carve anything in chiaro e scuro, in light and shadow. And he believes that he's the one that's come up with, well, he is on this side of the Alps. He's the one that,
right.
Yeah. But it's that 1516, it's an interesting year. So there's Titian in his mid-20s, and he starts cranking out some of these really amazing images that become remarkable woodcuts that could be used to decorate the walls of homes, that could extol the primacy of, Christ on earth, that large scale woodcuts that could be owned by many more people than just one collector. And I find that absolutely fascinating. So we have Titian actually handing off something to Ugo de Carpi in 1516, but I wanted to bring to your attention a couple other things that you and I have actually seen together as well. Once again, this is what Ann and Tru have seen on their peregrinations. There's a magnificent, and I'm going to use that again, grand scale monumental prints in the age of Dürer and Titian, Yummy Tummy show.
Yeah, it was a beautiful show in Philadelphia.
Oh my God.
It was gorgeous.
Delicious. And we took I think it was our first second crop of history prints students very early on. It was in 2009.
Oh, wow.
Ives and Lililis Malino, those folks were in that class.
Hi, Ryan. Hi, Chris.
And we actually, the Barbary map was the signature piece of the show. It was on the leading wall. And like, that's a bird's eye view. And I said, come on, guys. And we all laid down on our backs to look at it. And the guards came like, you couldn't do that. But we were like, yeah, it is. Ooh, see how he's doing it? So people were wondering if they were all supposed to lay down like we did. Wow. It only takes one person to start a peculiar trend.
Right.
However, so thinking about our friend Titian, I wanted to bring to our minds the triumphal chariot. And this is this amazing long, it's a procession, but think of it as, of course, it's Venice, the scene of the carnival and wonderful pageants and festivals, which would be celebrated by artists across all kinds of time. We're talking about now a series of woodcuts, 5 blocks that were stuck together. In this case, it says after Titian and an unknown artist, but 1517, the triumph of Christ. Well, you go blah, 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 you walk through, and what's, of course, in the absolute center of this 9-foot-long procession? Who's dead center?
Christ.
Of course.
Right.
All right. And so who's this big guy?
Oh, that's Christopher?
Christ Topher. Christ bearer, St. Christopher carrying, and these are all of the
Is he a giant? I didn't realize.
Yeah.
Oh, I'd forgotten that.
Yeah. St. Christopher is enormous, and that's why. But I love the fact that it's Christ Topher. You have a husband named Christ Topher, and then some boys that are named after Western people.
Well, Alex was named for Alexander the Great.
There you go.
The Greek connection in the family.
Okay, and then
Wyatt got a cowboy name.
Yeah, because
Rando.
Yeah. However, so the triumphant procession of Christ, and the little folks are labeled, and as they go wandering through, we can see people from the current times. You can see Titian putting together all the lessons of church history and whatnot, but right in front of Christ being transported by the various high-ranking, Pope and clergy and whatnot of Rome, let us say, is the tetramorph, and I love that word, tetra, the 4 various ways of depicting the 4 evangelists, the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so, help me here. San Marco, he's going to be the lion.
He's the lion.
Because if you think of San Marco in Venice, it's, of course, got the 4 lion heads all over it. Luke is signified by the
angel, the winged man?
No, by the ox. I'm sorry, because of his strength.
Oh, right.
Matthew is a winged man. I don't know I don't know who got to call this. Wow. And then, but John is the eagle, symbolized by the eagle, because he could fly the highest. He was the one that Jesus loved most, apparently. He's the snuggly one. But he's also thought to be able to fly, thank you, Google, so high that he could look directly into the sun. So these are the 4 writers of the gospel that follow the crucifixion. You see how the cross is there about 5/8 of the way along. And then the New Testament is what follows in front.
Oh, fascinating.
And it's just this kind of thinking, the humanist qualities of it, how well the figures are drawn, their proportions, the flow of the drapery. This is a Titian design. You can tell it's a Titian's design and simply by looking at the marks. And I think as folks look at this, they'll be able to see why I'm harping on how well the figures are rendered. I also adore the way all these banners and flags are whipping and whapping around and with little words flying. It's just got all kinds of wonderful, look, there are the tablets of law and there's the Ark of the Covenant.
Oh, right.
And there goes Adam and Eve. They're leading the whole procession.
Wow.
With amazing little tiny bits of foliage around the stuff because they're leading the whole kick.
And it's 15 inches tall.
But it's 9 feet long.
But it's 9 feet long because it's these pieces put together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it's beautifully joined too. So that tells you something about how Titian is able to organize space and how his compositions have well, if you really start studying this thing, you start to look at various kinds of diagonals that move us along, move us forward, even if it's arms or swords or what have you, so that it's not just looking like a bunch of jars on a shelf shuffling forward.
Because he's got a couple of clouds that
they're very directive, right?
Yes.
And the way he uses the clouds around the figure of Christ, which gives us some darkness, and the clouds that are in front of him, it just basically makes you look there. It's so smart.
Yeah.
And these kinds of enormous prints, this is a guy who's getting his name out there. He could have been commissioned for this, but there are others that you have to wonder, why on earth would Titian decide to do this? And then you have to think about the fact that these are always carved by somebody else, right? So Andrea Andriani apparently is the one that carved the Triumph of Christ. But we also have one that I remember us seeing at that show as well, which is the submersion of Pharaoh's army in the Red Sea.
Oh, golly.
And that's another magnificent, huge, mammoth, crazy thing. Now, of course, I've done the evil thing where I actually, because it's always in stupid centimeters, sorry, we're American.
You wrote the inches down.
And of course I did. So, but it's 3 feet, 10 inches tall by 7 feet.
How many blocks is that?
This one is 12. And again, the massive size of paper that is required to make this happen. In this particular image, which we're giving it, depending, I've seen it 15, 15, 15, 16, Halt says that, but these guys are saying 15, 13 to 16. I mean, obviously it's going to take some time to carve this. But again, you can see it's funny because in this particular impression, you can see that the ink has not gotten quite to the edges of each sheet. They do join up pretty danged effectively, but that lets you see what the scaffolding would be if it was a Florentine or a Roman kind of a composition. But because it's a Titian, you can see these armies getting consumed. They're literally just this wedge of humanity, and the Red Sea is just going to gobble them up. And it's pretty smart because Moses is leading his Israelites across, and they're going to be safe, and then Pharaoh's army is in pursuit, and they watch your Cecil B. DeMille. This is the first version of that Cecil B. DeMille scene.
Well, there's a huge amount of ocean and sky in the composition compared to the amount of space for the action of this army.
And look at how they are literally in this composition, they're being crushed by this wedge of water. And it's not even, but it's still very Venetian in terms of its motion. That there's water that's spilling, and that you can also see it's a choppy sea, and the sky is troubled. It's a troubled sky. You got craggy cliffs. You've got an interesting little cityscape back there. And, it's just fascinating to see how he can take this biblical story, and it's so filmic. And it's huge. This isn't something you just like, oh, look at this National Geographic map I just pulled out. You keep unfolding it and unfolding it, and then you can't refold it and put it back in the glove box. This is something that's clearly intended for a wall, something large that, and that would mean that people that couldn't hire Titian could certainly use paper to extol the masterful kinds of compositions that he's coming up with.
Because you can't possibly enjoy this as the intimate sort of one-to-one print thing that we are used to.
Well, a flood and completely consuming Pharaoh's armies doesn't exactly fit on a 4x8 note card, right? But it sure as hell will do well in a almost 4 foot by 7 foot. That's the size of a regular screen in a classroom, a pull down map.
Right.
Well, those didn't exist yet.
Right.
And he's making it, it's a movie. And that's the thing that I think it shows even more in a Titian print than it does in a Titian painting. And if we're thinking about the kinds of images that he's doing at this very time, this is when he's working on, let's say, the Madonna of the Pesaro family. It would be really fun for them to be able to see the Assumption of the Virgin and the Pesaro family, these steps that rise up. And
the paintings, you mean?
Yeah. And to see that, that's clearly his MO and how he's, using space. He was the king of colorito. We talk about the Venetian painters, and I have my musician students. They have to compare the more static forms and compositions of the Romans and the Florentines to the coloristic, different kinds of compositional devices of the northern artists, of the Venetian artists. I have them compare both because they're very different. And it's wonderful to see how they start picking it up. If you think about If it was a Florentine or a Roman kind of thing, those verticals would seem like bar lines, and the music would go chug, chug, chug along. But with Titian, he just draws you down into the center of his images with these diagonals and tilting triangles and all kinds of activity. And so he's creating at this time these enormous paintings for the Church of the Frari in Venice. Enormous things that are 17 feet tall. It doesn't surprise me in the least that he's creating black and white versions of these kinds of compositions. But the thing that is also fascinating is to see how his drawn mark, the woodcutters are attempting to emulate this very fresh kind of mark that he has. Other artists that, let's say Raphael, who knew that Marcantonio Raimondi was going to be doing his invenzione, his ideas, his designs, uses parallel hatching. It's all very systematic, and Marcantonio Raimondi can completely emulate that. And these have it's a completely different kind of a mark, requiring a different kind of a craftsperson, woodcarver, to emulate it. So I wanted to bring that to our attention. The other thing about the lines on this one is that the scholarship says that this particular, the Titian's submersion of Pharaoh's army in the Red Sea, was Titian drawing directly on the whitened blocks himself.
He did?
This is not a transcription.
Wow.
Which to me is really thrilling, as opposed to something that, there are those that would say, he punctured little holes and that's how it's transferred to the wood. There's plenty that indicates that he actually drew on the wood itself to give us this.
Usually people are handing over a drawing and the wood carver is translating it into a drawing on the wood. Or
a wood carver or the
somebody
engraver.
Else.
Yeah. Right. And so, they're literally, and that's also why often it will be reversed from the original drawing.
Right.
But I can sense, that the sensation of this particular woodcut is just too full of motion, like the brio that one would have moving a brush across a canvas, for me to think that, and there's plenty of colorism in this. You got two things. You got lights on and lights off. You got a black line, you got white space. And yet he has this frothing, it's astonishing to me how he manages to make that happen.
What do we always say in class? There's a world of color in black and white.
Oh, I always tell them that. There's a world of color in black and white. Why can't we use color? You don't need color. If you're good, you can get it all done in black and white.
Right.
Well, the last bit I wanted to bring to our attention about my friend Titian, because, there's so many things that he innovates as a painter, but what he also innovates for other things out there was this is the only place I could figure out where to put it. It is the Andreas Vesalius is on the fabric of the human body.
Right.
And it's an amazing, it's one of these things that if you went to art school and you had to take life drawing class periodically, you have to go through one of these atlases of anatomy. And there's always going to be a couple plates in there from Vesalius's On the Fabric of the Human Body, which was published in 1543. The first edition was published in 1543. Well, how can a book like that still hold up and be that vital and useful to artists of today? And artists of today could really learn a thing or two by actually looking at a book of anatomy. They don't have to be squishy little anime characters. They could actually have joints and, sorry. I used to think that you had to be able to draw to go to art school.
Well, that seems kind of basic.
Yeah, but apparently that's not a basic need anymore.
Right.
So when I have to teach drawing, it's interesting to try and meet somebody where they are and get them to a point where they can actually see, instead of assuming what things look like, that you actually really analyze them. And that's something that Titian could really, really do.
That whole idea of the radicalness of the diagonal composition, it's like, what do you do after you have vertical and horizontal? You go to the diagonal, right?
Sure, unless you didn't. Everything about it's radical. It's not finished like a Leonardo would be. It's using the paint as paint. In his later years, there's one I love to show. It's of the Christ being crowned with thorns. It's like 1473, and it's very late, and it's the light in it is. It just, they're mashing this crown of thorns down on Christ's head. This is Titian. But by then he's actually using you can see his fingerprints in the paint.
Oh.
He's still trying to get that light and the movement and the things that it was really odd. One of my students went, "Why?" I said, and I looked at him, "Why not?" And he looked so shocked. But that's Titian, right? It's like Titian mixes his paint with blood. That was the thought. He used color and this deliciousness of color, and it was on steroids compared to, the frescoes and the tempera paintings that were in the South. And remembering that the first real infusion of oil paint to the South into Florence was about 1476. So, Leonardo, yeah, he was working with oil paint, but it hadn't been around in the South that much. And here's a guy he grew up with oil paint. He cut his teeth on oil painting with Bellini and with Giorgione. Well, so my point here is that I wanted to talk about this astonishing thing about the anatomical illustrations for Andreas Vesalius On the Fabric of the Human Body. And this is a book that I appreciate him so much. My dear pal, Paul Espinoza at the George Peabody Library, I would always request this because this is the first really honest to God book of human anatomy ever, ever, ever in the history of medicine or art. And it is both. And the more I look into it, the more I realize that Vesalius wasn't just this superstar from Flanders who actually had been appointed to the University of Padua. And he was adept as a draftsperson. He could draw pretty damn competently, but he really did these dissections, and it was his job to do dissections at the University of Padua for these students. And periodically he would do sketches of what he was doing. And eventually he hired a fellow, Stefan del Carcar, something like that, who did carve his images. But for his big magnum opus, On the Fabric of the Human Body, it appears that he had either it was Titian or someone in Titian's circle who did the drawings for this astonishing book of human bodies. But the thing is that if we were to show these folks the difference between the dead rising from their graves and in the last pages of the Nuremberg Chronicle, which was from 1493, and you'd see these little fun, little hoppy-dancy kind of bone figures, the thing that's the oddest about them is to look at the pelvises, because clearly the artists hadn't seen what a pelvis actually looked like when they rendered this image of the dead coming from their graves. It's quite adorable. Now, the thing that's really fun about these German skeletons is that, yeah, sure, they look like skeletons. They've got these kind of weird loopy hairpin ribs, and a skull is a skull. Folks had seen skulls, but what folks hadn't seen was, let's say, what the spine does when it's down by the hips. And what does that part of the understructure of a human body look like? And a mere 50 years later, we have this astonishing tome that's published in Basel, which is now Switzerland, which is not part of the regular realm of, the Catholic Church. It's its own independent place, is this enormous tome. Paul Espinoza brings this so that I can show this huge book to my students. And the woodcuts in it are of the most incredibly high caliber, clearly carved in the Venetian area. And so I wanted to share this with you. There's a difference between the early skeletons and the skeletons that'll show up in the actual On the Fabric of the Human Body. Suddenly, instead of just being drawings of skeletons like you see on an anatomy chart, suddenly you see, well, Ann, what do you see when you look at these skeletons? Tell me.
Well, they seem to have gotten the pelvis right finally, but
finally, they've never seen it before, but they finally,
somebody did.
Somebody dissected down to that level, and
right.
Look, they have the proper number of ribs,
right, and the sternum and
mandibular,
and
all of
it.
Two
bones in the forearms there.
All the radius, it's all there. You got the tibia. You've got all of these super important places, plus the teeny little bitty ones, right?
Yes.
Everything is there.
But the funniest thing to me is that they're posed as if they're alive doing
exactly
things. Like
exactly
the monkeys playing cards or something.
Well, but this idea of the memento mori, remember, you will die. Well, here's skulls that have a pathos to them. They are actually in motion. Why, look, here's a skeleton that's using contrapposto. He's not just standing there like flattened out something, but he's gesticulating as though he's an orator, and he's leaning on a shovel, essentially saying, this will come. The next one, where we see a lateral view of the skeleton, and look, he's even has his legs crossed as he's leaning on this Roman sarcophagus, and here's a skull thinking and looking at his hand is on another skull. Shakespeare doesn't do Hamlet until 100 years later, 60 years later. But here we have someone contemplating what it is to be dead. And the gestures, the poses are tremendously living, especially on the view from behind.
Yeah.
He's literally lamenting, he's sobbing, and they're in actual environments.
Landscapes.
These are extraordinary woodcuts. And Vesalius had even left the letters off of these because he wanted for people to see them as their entities and not have them appear speckled, because everything about this treatise describes everything in type, but it has all these different sizes of type. They have to go into the images so they can be identified. He established the norm of what an atlas of human anatomy was. But the figures, the proportions of them, the references, they show us all of this Renaissance humanism. They show us the interest in antiquity. They show us wonderful canon-like proportions. They show a kind of depth and a poetry that we would have expected from Titian and his circle. So I find that fascinating. But wait, there's more, because it's the muscle men that completely blow my mind.
The muscles are amazing.
Well, nobody, of course, had ever done dissection like this. And Vesalius, he's the hell of 27, young Mr. Paduan is just so brilliant. And he dissects them down through the layers. So he literally peels away the superficial muscles and gets deeper and deeper and deeper so that you start to really understand till he gets literally down to the bone. Now, why am I interested in this? Because I was pre-med and I just, either as an artist or as a pre-med student, I stumbled across this and I was just out of my mind, It shows you movement. It shows you emotion. Look at the second of the muscle men, he's in an orator position again. But you also notice that, the various larger muscles will be laying down. You can understand what's seeing. But as you continue to leaf through these, they're just amazing as you see the hamstrings, or you see the gastrocnemius, and you see how the lateral muscles go across. You see how they attach to the pelvis. And then and this next bevy of them. Ann, tell me what you're noticing.
Wait, what's going on here? Wait, there's hair on that. Wait.
Now that one actually does have hair on his head. That's a little disturbing, but
that is weird.
But look at the second one here, this most glorious buff, Adonis-like body. It is
the Apollo Belvedere or something.
Yes, and it's so classically proportioned. Look at the beauty of the way those hands are arrayed. I mean, they're gesticulating. They're still hands, There's a humanity to them. The next one's disturbing because he's opened up the jaw so that you can see how it works underneath. But
that is disturbing.
And it has to be in some way.
Droops of skin, or I'm not sure what's drooping.
Okay, those are the larger muscles that have been cut from their origin, their insertion, so they flop down, so you can see the ones that radiate around your wrists to be able to show like how you can play piano, because you can't just have big bunchy ones. And then this last little batch.
Oh golly,
they're just really. Now, tell me more about what you think you see.
Well, it's more really dynamic poses is really the thing I'm saying.
Absolutely. It's the poses. It's the movement. It's literally the transmission of weight from one foot to another. We can see the side of the body. You can see how the muscles wrap around. And it's not just one group of muscles, because these are artful. And when I read you this passage that Vesalius was after, you're going to be amazed. Notice also behind all of these figures, please.
Oh, is it a continuous landscape?
Yes, it is.
What?
Yes, it is.
Do those all appear in a...
Yes, they all hook up to be one continuous landscape, whether it's old ruins or part of a city or a little farm.
Oh, gosh.
But it's a continuous landscape. You can hear me turning pages, but watch.
Yeah, oh, God.
Now, why is that any different than a triumphal procession? What kind of concept of understanding this proceeding through the various levels and layers of the body down to the bone? That's a master draftsperson, artist, somebody who can see all of it. It's not a technician. This is somebody who has created figures that have meaning, so that there's a drama to this whole story.
But so Vesalius made drawings and Titian perfected them?
Essentially.
Set them in their settings?
Okay, so the thing that's interesting about all of this is that, yes, the early ones, if you look at some of the early skeletons, you can tell that, Vesalius drew those, and then they were woodcut by his, Alcalcar, and they said, look at even this hyperextended knee.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. Let me see. it's interesting that the entire book was assembled. It was the entire book, woodcuts and the accompanying letterpress, was prepared in Italy and shipped in 1542 to Johannes Oporius in Basel, which is Basel.
It's the first time we've had Basel pop up.
Yeah. Well, it's also not, it's for 1543.
Yeah.
It's after the Reformation.
Oh.
It's not Catholic.
Right. Oh, so they can.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And it's the first of its time. Now, here's the other thing I love, is that Vesalius was so militant about the quality of the blocks. I love this. He writes, when he sends off all of this, he says, this is the Dr. Vesalius talking about this. He says, special care should be employed on the impressions of the plates, which are not to be printed like ordinary textbooks with simple line engravings. Nowhere should the import of the picture be neglected, unless perhaps where the delineation is above all that in the printing. You copy as closely as possible the proof struck off by the engraver as a specimen. They sent the BAT, what we now call the bon à tirer. Tell them what a bon à tirer is.
Bon à tirer is French for good to pull, which in a print shop means this is the one that's perfect and all that follows should be compared to and look like.
Exactly. And likewise, take care of what I consider most artistic and so pleasing in these pictures, that the thickness of the lines which produce gradation in the shadows is tastefully rendered. And he continues to explain how important it is that these be presented. And Vesalius understands how to draw. He knew how to do it with chalk. He did it with hatchings, but he turned it over to either to Titian or the workshop of Titian. And so the anatomical drawings, they're so sensibly seen. It had to be someone that was as highly trained as Titian. And because there were no medical people that could draw that well and draw the human figure. And so this relationship between the artist and the anatomist is pretty remarkable. And and Vesalius knew that this wasn't just for medical students and their colleagues. He says it's also for artists. And they were the most avid students of anatomy during the Renaissance were the artists. And so the function of the Fabrico in the studio is fully attested by various drawn copies of the illustrations all the way into the 20th century. And many of them will say, the anatomy of Titian. Now, here's something. Vesalius would write something like this. This illustration presents mainly the anterior aspect of the body, from which I have removed the skin with the fat and fleshy membrane and all the nerves, veins, and arteries. It had been my intention to leave this illustration, as well as the following, free of lettering, so that it might not appear spotted to the observer, since the third is really the first I prepared for teaching purposes. The present one displays what we do not observe skillful painters and sculptors to emphasize often in muscular and, as it were, ideal representations of men. He's creating this and stripping the various muscles down because he says in the writing in the book, artists, you need to know what's going on under the big outer layers. And he expects them to use it. Moreover, it is not enough for them to understand exactly the superficial muscles, for in addition to an accurate knowledge of the bones, they must have a full understanding of the function of each muscle as shorter, longer, more prominent, or compressed. And you have to keep it constantly in mind that when a muscle moves a bone, it contracts to its belly, as it were, becomes shorter, and as it gathers towards the middle of the belly, much more prominent. He's literally schooling artists in this first air quotes, medical book. And it's enormous. And there are gatefolds. Vesalius, there are whole plates where he has dissected out all of the veins, the nervous structure. There's another one where...
It must have taken years.
Here's the thing, 4.
What?
Yeah, I know. He did it in 4 years. Between what is it? 1539 and 1543, 4 years. But that's what he did,
Who paid for it?
That's a great question. More things to find out, and soon. We can tell from the information with Vesalius's writings that there was more than one artist, more than one carver, and you can check that there are different levels of quality. It's also interesting. He also shows us cross sections of the skull. Sometimes, as you like slicing through the brain, which will look like MRI generated, but they'll have. Here's the part that's the weirdest. Some will still have hair on them or a mustache. You can see that they're very definitely were still human.
Oh, gosh.
They just shoot right through the head. And then in the back, there's like a whole nother woodcut. It shows all the various tools that we use. Now, those aren't by Titian. He didn't need Titian for those, but it's the most thorough description of everything you need to know about the fabric of the human body.
I'm curious to know who paid for it, and my Googling will tell us that it's Charles V.
Oh, right. Because he ingratiated,
He dedicates it to Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor.
Which is bizarre, because that's such a turnaround. Because Charles V is the one that sacked Rome.
Right.
So don't look, okay, this is where me, the art historian, goes, and that's some history that you can talk to some specialist about. But the fact is that Vesalius was that highly regarded, right?
Yeah.
And that this book was intended for all kinds of people. I love this part. The entire project is such scope and was prepared in such a surprisingly short time, between about 1539 and 42, that one must assume a number of artists and cutters were involved. Vesalius himself alludes to such a situation in his letter on the China route, in which he declares that he no longer has, quote, to put up with the bad temper of artists and cutters who make me more miserable than did the bodies I was dissecting.
Oh, my God. Oh, hell.
We're still talking about people, right? But at the same time, thinking about the conception, the ingenious, the disegno, the invenzione, those ideas, and even how to get the light and the shadow are of primary importance. And this is the kind of image that you could expect from a Titian. When you look at his other large woodcuts, you can say, so it's either somebody that's in his studio that understands it, or it's himself. And so, that, the continuous landscape background, the style of the drawing, it's like, it's so tasty, yummy. So we don't know who all the cutters were, but there are over 230 illustrations in the book. But you can be super excited about these 14 muscle men. Mm-hmm. You've been astonished to see the level of this from 1543, which is just 50 years after those silly little goofy dancing skeletons, and all of the blocks existed. My last bit on this, all of the blocks existed. They were held in Munich and were in perfectly wonderful shape. They had done another printing from the blocks in the 30s. Anna's already, pressing her brow and feeling terrible. And you're exactly right. Why do you think this is sad?
They were destroyed in the war?
Yes, they were. So after 4 centuries,
Jesus Christ,
the blocks were still all there and they got blasted. Thank you. And that's the beauty of books, though, is that, there's more than one.
There you go. See, that's exactly why we're doing this.
Yeah. And there's more than one. And to the point that it needed a second printing.
Right.
In 1555.
Right.
Now, Vesalius was already gone by then, but it would be wonderful to even, if you had an opportunity just to read the front page of it, and you can see Vesalius, a portrait of him in the operating theater, the conception of the idea of the theater of dissection as with the same kind of rapt attention to like any kind of CSI kind of thing, the forensics of it. Right. In fact, if you look at the cover of it, you'll even see that in one corner there's a nude body leaning around the corner to see like, oh, are you getting it right? You can see all of these different kinds of, it is very theatrical and wonderful. And yet it's a, quote, medical book there to teach artists as well. I love that. So the idea of Titian's impact on history in woodcut is phenomenal. Right. And I think it spurs on things like that. Anne's looking right there at the cover.
Page.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you see?
Well, there's the theater of dissection is packed with people all over the place. There's even dogs in there.
Mm-hmm. A dog and a monkey.
What's the monkey doing
there?
Well,
it might be something about aping how things were done. It's thought that maybe even Galen is in there because this supersedes Aristotle and Galen's conception of the human body. And are we aping at God, at being God? I mean, there's all kinds of little possibilities of what the instincts could be. There are others would say we would never operate on a human body. We would dissect a dog before we would dissect a human.
But it's interesting. Like some of the characters up front look like they're wearing kind of biblical robes, Greek robes, Roman robes,
Right.
You get some contemporary dress in the back there.
So it's a sacra conversazione. It's a secular conversazione, right? And so one source I was looking at actually used the conception of how this is put together in the same way that Raphael's Disputa is presented in the Pope's apartments, where it's Vesalius who is spreading, he's giving it, like as the Pope would take the word from God, Vesalius is taking this idea of creation and opening it up and showing it to all that are around them. And so that the complexity of the composition of even the title page of this tome is astonishing. It's it defies imagination. 1543. And that's the same year as Copernicus, by the way.
Oh.
So,
It's like, I mean, after the Bible, I suppose, but not real. I mean, the Bible is sort of a history, but it's kind of more of a spiritual guidance thing. Like, this is fact.
absolutely. I mean, absolutely. And yet you can see that as a humanist, he values the human. It's not just stuff it's not like disassembling a car. That he is respecting the humanity of these subjects in terms of this is what the body is. I just think that there's still a reverence in there for, there's that going into a terra incognita, but having like you respect the sea. You don't just take it for granted because it could squash you.
Sure.
The body, you have one, but do you really know what it does and how it works? And let's open it up and see how this is why the pre-med kid in me who decided, because of organic chemistry and calculus as a freshman, and this is before we discovered Adderall, that wasn't going to work for me. But when you see these kinds of things, it just ignites. And of course, that makes perfect sense as to why I do all that bony stuff too. But I came to that after I didn't know about Vesalius.
What?
Yeah, I didn't know about those skeletal things.
Yeah, Tru. So Tru has made a series of woodcuts in years past that are reimaginings of paintings, but at the skeletal level.
No, beneath the old masters.
Beneath the old masters. And they're quite something. And truly reflect your interest in anatomy and your pre-med life and your medical illustration life. And
yeah, but I would hope that they still, like the barbarian map, that they give information, but they also give a sense of that even though they might be creepy, that's how who would look at skeletons, but there's got to be a loveliness in there too. We all own one, right?
Right.
I don't know if we even own them. We have one inside us, and are we going to be afraid of it, or are we going to really understand just how exceptionally beautiful it is?
I love a skeleton.
Yeah, they're really amazing. Did you know I have an actual skull downstairs?
Yes, I think I did.
Oh, it's here now.
Okay.
Dead Bob's downstairs, of course, but
and we still need to take you to the Mutter Museum.
Oh, heck
Philadelphia.
Yeah! Heck yeah! Still haven't been.
There's a place to look up.
So when Holtz would say that, Linda Holtz in her History of the Western World would say that woodcut was really concerned with book illustrations and whatnot, but I would beg to differ. That we could say that there's plenty in woodcut in the 1500s. There was another fellow that I have to mention. He's an oddball. And
Besides Titian?
This is my buddy Giuseppe Scolari.
Oh, right, Scolari.
He's just an oddball, but he's one of those, you'd ask Ben about artworks that kind of shook you down to the right down your jimmies, know? This Scolari woodcut is one I saw on the wall first in a show at the National Gallery. It just buckled my knees. And this is in the early days of me finding out how much I love to carve wood. And it's an entombment. Literally, they're going to be laying Christ's body into the tomb, and it's done about 1580. And by now, Titian is dead, and Michelangelo is dead. But here's an artist who is giving us, some of those same Titian-esque diagonals. But there's something about the way the sculpting of the wood in giving us the back of a person lovingly picking up the winding cloth of Jesus, and he's got the heavy bottom part of Jesus, and there's another guy with his hands under his armpits, and they're going to lower him into the tomb, and just really looking at the light and shadow, the drama of that thing, it just buckled me. I think it was also the cross contours, the way the lines literally move around the figures and describe them as volumes. It's not a woodcut like on a flat 2D surface. It was it's like a sculpture that happens to be on a flat surface. Mm-hmm. What do you think when you see it?
Yeah, I agree with you. It's quite. I mean, it's big, so it's 27 by 17, which is pretty big. But the image I'm looking at on my computer is pretty small, and it looks like a wood engraving. Like has that finery to it.
Mm-hmm, refinement, yeah.
Yeah.
But, and the second time I saw it, you had just gotten it, and it was one of the new
Oh, yeah.
Woodcuts, they were like one of the new light. It was a capital campaign or something.
It was a recent gift, yeah.
Yeah, and so me, the spoiled history of prints teacher, my buddy Ann would say, "Come on up here, I got some stuff in the Tru drawer." And you open it up and I'm like, "Oh, the Scolari!" And you went and you got that face at me. I'm like, "What?" And she goes, "Why do you know that?" It was because I'd seen this one print by this guy, and there it was, like in my own backyard. And God, it's so vivid and it's so strong, and it describes the figures so beautifully.
It's almost too perfect. You know what I mean? Like it's looking less like Titian is so, because he leaves edges alone, and like this is so described.
And I think that's why it feels sculptural as opposed to painterly.
Yeah.
And I see your point exactly, because he's in a land by himself. Scolari seems to be. We know that he was a member of the Painters Guild between something like, 1592 and 1607. We don't exactly have his birth and death dates, but we do see him experimenting in wonderful ways. The one that Holtz uses in History of the Print in Western World is neat, but it didn't grab me as much. If you think across the century, we're talking about Scolari, and now we're, up to about 1580. In the prior episode, we had talked about the chiaroscuro woodcut, and we can see that Italian artists are definitely using woodcut for expressive means. And this last Scolari takes us right back to a very Catholic way of looking at and making artwork. This is the one that Holtz uses in her book is The Man of Sorrows. And it was done apparently at roughly the same time as the Entombment. And it has that same strong sculptural sense to it. But Holtz makes a valid point that the way he carves this, it almost looks like white on black.
Yeah.
Because the Christ is the Man of Sorrows. It's half length. He's got the crown that's been jammed on his head. There's some drapery behind. He's obviously been scourged. They've lashed him and mocked him, and they've given him a, air quotes, scepter. Then he says, "Ha ha, yes, you're king of the Jews, ha ha." And he's been thrashed. He's weeping. But it really is coming out of the darkness. I suppose that's why that's why I love it so. It's a Scolari because it's drawn. Because when I teach drawing, I'm always trying to get them to see, letting light cut through and to see the light and shadow. And when you look at all of the Scolaris that you can on Google, you'll notice that diagonal. But the way he deals with the light and lets it shine on there and lets it be absolutely white, it's just extraordinary to me. Somehow, the Man of Sorrows is a little too gaudy for my tastes, and the Entombment is more visceral. But I can see how this Man of Sorrows with a kind of carving that does look painterly in a way. Like if the Man of Sorrows, look at how many varieties of marks he's making.
I find it fascinating that there's a floral drapery behind him.
That you can't even see in a book. That's why one has to get an honest-to-God print.
So weird.
Yeah. And I think maybe that's why I didn't groove on it as much. But you know what? That also sort of really puts this one into that whole Mannerist realm. And you can almost see with this high contrast, it's like, Caravaggio wasn't the first one to put things in extreme light and shadow. It's here. Well,
it also, for me, is calling up much later examples, as though people like Gustave Doré was looking at him.
Yes, very good. Yes.
Yeah. Even later people like, not Rockwell Kent, but like somewhere in that realm.
Those Magic Realist museum with a lot of the dark of the block, even Barry Moser. For sure. And that same kind of parallel line usage. I agree with you completely. It would be really fun to throw in a Doré so they could see. But we know of Doré as he's an illustrator. We don't think of him as a fine artist. And that's why I think it's fun to trot out somebody like Giuseppe Scolari, who is such a unique being.
He's very much aside. Like he doesn't get seen much.
And he should. But it was also interesting to he's
an outlier.
He's a total kind of like Blake, but not, because if you look at what he's done, and going back to this Entombment, you can see the future in that, and I find that absolutely thrilling. But there's something about the heaviness of Christ's body, the pathos of it.
And I think you're right about the back of the figure that's got his knees or is trying to get his knees. Like labor.
Yeah, oh yeah. It's not just the idea of, sacrifice, and then even the way the lines are working on the mourners on the left, it's like the descending lines in music. You can hear them sobbing. And it's extraordinary to see that work. And then that one flourish of drapery into the sky, which gives it even more downward force. We talk about a lot of stuff, but, every now and then it's fun to just focus on something that knocked you for a loop. And like the bird's eye view of Venice. My God, how is that possible from 1500? How is this possible? This thing that just sort of came out of the sky and made me so very happy.
Right.
So that's all I really have to say about the Italians and woodcut, except that they used it a lot. And you can see it being used for so many different kinds of reasons, from the scientific to the analytic to, the map of Venice and showing their might. It's great propaganda. It's useful. Oh, and then, of course, you can make wall coverings out of prints, too. And we'll probably get to that a little bit more when we talk about the engravers in the 15th century.
Right.
But that's all I got for this part.
Shoo, that was a long one. I must have missed the Titian day in Art History 101 because I feel like I just have never known that much about him. And boy, am I a fan now. Thanks for listening to Platemark, A History of Western Printmaking, our episode on Titian and Vesalius. As always, I need to thank my amazing co-host, Tru, who, I just don't know how he does it. And also a thank you to Michael Diamond for the use of his original music. There are images that go along with these episodes. They're available to you, everything that we talk about, on the show notes page of platemarkpodcast.com. So you could go over there and check those out while you listen. Also on the new website, there is a microphone icon at the lower right, which is a place you can leave a voicemail for us. You could call and leave us a question or a compliment. We'd love that. Maybe we'll do a listener questions episode at some point. So thank you so much again for joining us, and we will see you next time.